Hi, I hope everyone is as healthy and as comfortable as you can be in these crazy times, and I hope that you are enjoying this online course. Um, my name is Professor Paul Musselwhite. I am a professor of history at Dartmouth, and my focus is primarily in my own research on the 17th and 18th centuries in English and British North America. But my task for today is to lead you through a broad overview of the history of epidemic disease and contagion and the ways that it impacts empire, European empire, from the 16th right the way through into the early 20th century. And because of my own specialization, we'll be thinking about this primarily through the lens of the British Empire, but I'll hopefully be making some comparisons that will allow you to think about how this applies to European imperialism more broadly. And this will also pair up with some of the readings that you have been asked to do in connection with this lecture. So at various points I'll drop in with a few questions and things to consider. If you've already read the material, you can think about them then, or as you read the material, you can think about these questions as you do so. So to jump into things then. We're thinking here about contagion and colonialism and the impact of epidemics on the shape of European empires. And I mean that in two ways, really. Firstly, the very literal shape of empires, because European empires are one of the first globalizing forces, right? They send people from Europe all around the world. They interconnect in new ways different parts of the globe, and that means interconnecting pathogens, bacteria, and the things that cause disease. They bring different diseases to from different parts of the world into connection with each other, to different peoples, to themselves, but also to other peoples. And in those ways, they are in some respects vectors for the spreading of disease, and also victims themselves of those diseases and of the agency of those diseases. So diseases allow empires to function in certain ways in some places and in certain ways in other places. And so we'll be thinking about the way that the shape of empire, the literal shape, where there's a colony, where there isn't, what kinds of colonies exist in different parts of the world, are constrained by the impact of disease. We'll also be thinking on a deeper level about what Europeans come to conceptualize empire as, the ways that they begin to think about imperialism, which is a fairly new concept in an extra-European context, right, in the 16th century, the ways that they conceptualize what it means to go out and colonize the world in terms of disease, because disease helps them to understand what it is that's different about them from other people, the way they construct difference, the way they construct race, and the way they construct the state's capacity to expand and to formulate its power over great distances. And so we'll be thinking about the impact of disease not simply on the spatial organization of empire, but also on the theoretical, the intellectual foundations of European imperialism, with which we are still, in many respects, living today. So as a way to jump into this then, we need to understand that disease was foundational to the way that Europeans encountered places beyond their shores. Now, you've already seen some of this going in the opposite direction. I know that you've already thought about virgin soil epidemics and the Columbian exchange, the idea that after Columbus's arrival, pathogens, fruits, vegetables, animals, all sorts of things that had been separated by the Atlantic Ocean are thrown together and exchanged. And a big impact of that is the role that disease has upon indigenous American societies in all sorts of ways. We tend to focus on that, and quite rightly so, because the human toll there of those diseases is huge. But on the other level, Europeans also suffered from new diseases. They suffered from, they were crucially aware that when they ventured outside of Europe, they would encounter new diseases. Even before, for example, the English travel to permanently establish a successful colony in the Americas, shall we say. You see here George Watson on the left-hand side, his 1598 tract called The Cures of the Diseases in Remote Regions, Preventing Mortality Incident in Foreign Attempts of the English Nation. So here we see a book from the 1590s, right, when the English are beginning to think about expanding beyond their shores, that is framed in terms of, if we're going to do this, we're going to encounter disease, we're going to encounter epidemics that we can't handle. This is going to be a part of what it means to, one of the challenges of expanding, and understanding the world beyond Europe as one that's framed by diseases. And this is obviously predicated on the experience that the Spanish and the Portuguese had already had. It's predicated on experience that English and other Europeans had had in failed colonies, as well as the successful Spanish and Portuguese ones, right? So by this point, the English have already failed in various colonial efforts in Guyana. They failed at the famous Roanoke venture in North Carolina. The French have failed repeatedly to settle in Florida. And so the English have failed in Newfoundland, and in many of these times and places, disease has played at least a significant role in the human toll that has destroyed these colonies and led them to be unsuccessful. And that goes on to be the case in the earliest foundations of stories of successful English colonies as well, right? I mean, and I begin with this just because it reminds us of the centrality of these diseases from the very beginning of English colonialism. You may be familiar with some of this, right? With Jamestown, with the story of the first permanent English colony in North America that is decimated. In the first year, as I note here, there are 108 settlers left in 1607 when the first English voyage goes to Jamestown. By the following spring, there are only 38 of those surviving. They send more colonists then over the next couple of years, and in the winter of 1609, they leave 500 settlers at Jamestown to endure what becomes known as the starving time. And of those, by the time they get back in the spring, only 60 are alive. So the mortality rates here are huge. Obviously, disease is not the only factor here. We also have to factor in the impact of warfare with indigenous peoples, and, as the starving time suggests, the lack of food, the lack of ability to grow food. But, of course, those things combine with disease in many cases to explain why people died, right? So actually, disease has this big impact, typhoid and dysentery in particular, on Jamestown, right? So disease is a foundational aspect of the experience of English colonists in the New World. And it doesn't just stop with Jamestown. We tend to think about Virginia as being particularly unhealthy, and Jamestown Island in particular as being unhealthy, and I'll come to that again in a little bit. We'll revisit why that is and what that means. But it goes on in other places too. We tend to think of New England as being much safer and much more hospitable to Europeans. But there's a 50% mortality rate in the first Plymouth colony in 1620. Over that first winter. And even Boston, 10 years later, after gaining the advantage of having both the Plymouth colony and settlement at Salem in the Massachusetts Bay already by the time the Puritans arrive in Boston in 1630, even that first winter, Winthrop and his colleagues experienced 20% mortality in that first winter, with all the experience they have by that point, because disease is so foundational to the experience of English colonists coming to the New World. And you can see the way in which Winthrop here, as this quote that he's writing to his wife, who's just traveling over the following year to join him, talking about the fact that he has been, he and his healthy colleagues have been surrounded by so many dead corpses through the winter because of the impact of disease. And so this is the foundational role that disease plays from the very beginning, from even before, as Watson shows, the foundational role that disease plays in European conceptions of America and experiences of America. But the contagions that they encounter, of course, are different. They differ through time and they differ by space. And so as we are working our way through this lecture, we'll be encountering a number of different contagions and all sorts of different viruses and illnesses that Europeans encountered in imperialism. Going from dysentery and typhoid, those first few that they really encounter in North America, that are also prevalent in Europe, to the tropical mosquito-borne things like dengue and malaria and yellow fever that they've really experienced in Africa, but they also really experience in the Caribbean in trying to settle the Caribbean, to the other specific African illnesses that they encounter, sleeping sickness, bilharzia, guinea worm, yaws, that really shape the way in which colonialism in Africa can function, and then through to the new kinds of infections like cholera, cholera and the resurgence of bubonic plague that really frame the way that Europeans encounter Asia in the 19th century and their experiences of disease in Asian colonialism in the 19th century. So what we're going to do then with this lecture is that the rest of this is going to be broken up into 4 parts that you can either listen to all the way through, or you can break up and sort of think about as separate chunks. But I'm just going to lay out for you here. What we've got here are a section that you'll think about the agency of epidemics in empire, the ways, and this is the more literal ways in which empires kill certain percentages of populations, the ways that mortality rates frame where empires can and can't operate, and really shape the foundations of different forms of empire in different places around the world at different points. But then we'll pivot into thinking about the ways that empire conceptualizes disease and the ways that people think about what it means to be ill and to adjust to new forms of environment, and what that means about the people they encounter and their ability to deal with certain kinds of diseases, and what makes them, therefore, Europeans, therefore, different from the people they encounter, and how that justifies and frames their colonialism. So we'll be thinking about that. And then we'll think about the way, in another short section, the way that science evolving in the 18th century helps to refine those ideas about disease, and therefore helps to refine ideas about race that help to justify the emergence of much more racially stratified and organized and exploitative empires in the 18th century. And then finally, we'll have a section where we think about the role that the evolution of scientific knowledge about bacteria and pathogens in the mid to late 19th century frames a new idea of tropical medicine that helps Europeans to think about empires in other parts of the world, helps them to reframe their experience with different people groups into a developmental framework, the ways that empires become paternalistic and expand beyond settler empires into exploitation of and control over subject peoples through the patronizing frameworks of tropical medicine and the ways in which colonial subjects push back against that in various ways. And so those are the units that we'll cover here. You can, as I said, look at these videos, just follow them straight through, or you can listen to them separately and think about them as different units.